Some of you already attended our other vaccination information workshop that was put on by UCLA Health, which was more about the facts of the vaccine versus the vaccine in the workplace. So this is part 2 of 2, and we're happy to have our favorite labor attorney, Christina Carrasas, join us, although she has to change the logo on the top of the screen because it still says Landecker Barron. So, but anyhow, Christina received her JD from Southwestern Law School in 2011, where she served as a judicial extern to the Honorable Philip S. Gutierrez of the Central District of California. She received her BA with honors from the University of Southern California in political science, emphasis in philosophy in 2021, or 2001. Before joining the Landecker, Rivas, Verano, and Davis Law Group, Christina ran a solo practice devoted to advising employers in employment law matters and representing employees in a wide variety of employment disputes. In order to broaden her understanding of the employer-employee relationship, she subsequently specialized in complex business litigation, focusing her practice in areas of employment, employee benefits, and healthcare litigation. Upon joining Landecker, Rivas, Verano, and Davis, Christina discovered her passion for educating, training, advising, and defending employers in all areas of employment law. She's a regular presenter before many HR and business organizations, including the Chamber. And in 2019, the Greater San Fernando Valley Chamber of Commerce nominated her and elected her to our board of directors. Christina is a member of the Labor and Employment section of the State Bar of California, the San Fernando Valley Bar Association, and the Eastern European Bar Association. And with that, take it away, Christina.
Thank you, Nancy. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us this Friday morning. As the COVID vaccine is being administered, many employers, many of you are wondering whether you can or should make this vaccine a required condition or a voluntary policy. So let's jump right into it. So on December 16, at the end of last year, the EEOC issued its much anticipated guidance on the topic. And while the guidance answers some questions, it sort of leaves a lot to be desired, and the broader message is not that simple. So I'm here to walk you through the landscape of what the guidance is and the legal landscape. So as you probably know at this point, the availability of the COVID-19 vaccine is going to shape a lot of our decision making. We are now vaccinating healthcare workers, long-term care residents, as well as 1B of the plan is to vaccinate individuals age 65 and older. So the availability of the vaccine is going to play a factor in the determination of whether to make it mandatory or voluntary. And so here are the sector populations being vaccinated. So you got to take that into consideration.
You know,
What's that, Nancy?
Changed some of that yesterday, right? That in 2 weeks are going to allow more areas in.
Absolutely. I think that this is an ever evolving, quickly changing topic. And so it's helpful to stay tuned and be in touch with the chamber. Nancy does an amazing, and Fayumi do an amazing job keeping us all posted. So the legal landscape of things is that we look to the EOC guidelines, and but the good news is that nothing in the ADA or the Title VII of the Civil Rights Act precludes employers from conditioning employment on requiring this vaccine or proof of receipt of the vaccine. So, and we'll take a look at that in greater detail in just a little bit. And I think the major concern is that as an employer, you must keep the workplace free of recognized hazards, which at this point is the COVID-19 virus. And obviously, you are also mandated to maintain the individual rights of employees, which we'll go into in just a little bit. So generally, with some critical limitations, you as an employer can enforce mandatory vaccine policy. And we'll go into the bottom line in just a little bit. Just for ease of reference, I wanted to contrast vaccinations with employee screenings, medical exams. so that it's a little bit more of a practical view. So employers' right to screen is generally more limited than the right to require vaccinations. So current permissible practices of temperature checks, symptom screening, which I know many of you may be doing, and COVID testing are based on the severity of the pandemic, as you know. And I think that this is a huge carve out that was made by the EOC for the pandemic alone. And that is mainly because the nation has recognized that there is a significant risk of substantial harm that someone with the virus or symptoms of it would present in the workplace. Now, OSHA and Cal-OSHA, under OSHA, there's a general duty clause that essentially tells the employer that the employer has a duty to maintain a workplace that's free of recognized hazards. So I think that, just going back to the slide for a second, that is a fairly broad provision under which you can include a lot of different things. So I believe that the vaccination fits well within that provision, that obligation that you have as an employer. Under the Americans with Disabilities Act, you as an employer are not permitted to discriminate, as I know all of you know, specifically against employees on the basis of a disability. So if an employer requires some accommodation on the basis of a disability, you aren't allowed to just say, no, we aren't going to accommodate you, right? So, and I think that there is a limitation to that duty, which is that if a reasonable accommodation is unduly burdensome to you as the employer, then you can lawfully exclude those employees from the workplace, from the work site. So the EOC's guidance is what we're left with today. And the guidance makes clear, however, that this doesn't mean that you can automatically terminate the worker if you can just say, oh, undue burden, right? So you still have an obligation, not only under federal law, but also under California law, to engage in an interactive process with the employee to determine the extent to which, and sometimes, if at all, a reasonable accommodation may allow the employee to perform the essential duties of the position without imposing this undue hardship on the employer. But I have to tell you that having defended many lawsuits that employees file on this basis, failure to accommodate, failure to engage in the interactive process, 99% of the time, the judge isn't going to look at this very favorably. In other words, if you say, oh, this is an undue burden, I think that the judge is going to be very skeptical in reviewing the particulars, the facts involved in the request for an accommodation. And I think it's important for you to truly, in good faith, engage in the interactive process and truly check and document that you've checked. And so I think that if you're looking to use this as a loophole, it isn't going to work. And I want to caution you that the courts are very clear about that. So the EOC, for example, identifies specifically that remote work arrangements are possible reasonable accommodations in certain circumstances. And I know that in recent months, many employers have transitioned to that, but at the same time, that arrangement isn't available in every industry and for not available to every employer. So I think that those employers who have examined it, who have said that this is a possibility for you, you should be prepared to identify factors that now preclude employees who object to vaccines, and we'll go into that in just a little bit, for reasons related to disability or religion, from continuing to work remotely. So I also outlined some bullet points on here that the ADA essentially outlines that the guidelines or the policy for the vaccination must be job-related, consistent with business necessity, and the employee must pose a significant risk of substantial harm in unvaccinated state, and that you must apply these guidelines uniformly. And whatever happens, if an employee, for example, requests accommodation, you need to protect the employee's privacy, their medical information, to make sure that whatever accommodation that they're seeking, whatever forms they're filling out, that those forms and that information remains absolutely confidential. And similarly, under Title VII, you may be required to accommodate an employee's sincerely held religious belief. So keep that in mind, and we'll go into that in just a little bit. So the policy for addressing vaccine expectations, I want to address this because this is really what it comes down to. Is many of my clients are adamant that they want to require it, depending on what industry they're in, and some have gone from being adamant about requiring it to just saying, you know what, I think we're going to offer it as a voluntary policy. So if you are going to make this determination, be aware that any requirement should be based on objective facts, and that this determination should be tied to the employee's job duties, the job description, and as I mentioned before, it should be consistently administered across the board. What we do is we put together a policy that clearly describes the expectations and the rationale behind it, so that the employees understand that this is, based in reason and logic. Explain that if you are seeking an exemption as an accommodation, this is the way to seek it. And again, typically when I put together a policy like this, I sit down with the employer and figure out the industry that they're in and what expectations and goals that they have, and figure out what their employees would want to see, and also the leeway that they should give them. So I think that it's important to have the process outlined and follow the individualized accommodation process diligently. This isn't going to be, one size fits all type of process. So you need to be clear that you're going to examine each case on a case-by-case basis and ensure that no retaliation is happening on the basis of an employee requesting an accommodation or requesting an exemption. And as I mentioned before, make sure to safeguard that all medical information stays confidential and is separate from the employee's personnel file. I typically advise my clients to keep a separate medical file, so that in the absolute worst case scenario that you are involved in litigation, everything is going to be subject to discovery. But you can segregate your files so that if you're pre-litigation and the other side asks for personnel files, payroll records, and everything that they're entitled to under labor code, that you can lawfully leave out things that aren't in the personnel file. So keep that in mind. So the bottom line on the EEOC guidance is that you can establish a mandatory vaccination policy if the need for it is job-related, or if remaining unvaccinated individuals would pose a direct threat to other employees, or your patients, your customers, or themselves. And this is according to the written guidance released. It's out there. You can Google it and find it yourself. And just for your own information, whatever stats we have out there, over 80% of employees get flu vaccines when required, and almost twice the rate as when vaccines are strongly encouraged. Okay, so there's, let me just give you a little bit of an example. So a dentist could make a case that an unvaccinated hygienist would be a danger to others, or a retailer could say that a cashier is at risk because of daily exposure to customers, and they have a choice to make that a mandatory vaccine or a voluntary one. And the assessment will be based on the nature of their industry. And again, it's going to be reviewed on a case-by-case basis if an employee requests an exemption from vaccination. And some of you have already sent in a question to me directly about the standard for determining whether an unvaccinated employee poses a direct threat to others in the workplace. And what we have is basically, you need, as an employer, have a reasonable belief and objective evidence that the unvaccinated employee would pose a direct threat. And again, I emphasize that the belief has to be reasonable. It must be based on objective evidence that an employee who does not receive a vaccine will pose a significant risk of substantial harm to the health or safety of the individual, themselves, or others, including your patients, customers, that cannot be eliminated or reduced by a reasonable accommodation. So what this boils down to is a test. There are 4 factors that, so you're looking at the duration of the risk, the nature and severity of the potential harm, the likelihood that the potential harm will occur, and the imminence of the potential harm. So I think that when looking at these factors, I also want you to be thinking about the new OSHA regulations, and also what the CDC gave us, which is, what is, close contact when we look at exposure to COVID, when we look at our obligation to provide notice to employees and, potentially patients. Look to see, how long this employee will be interacting with patients, customers, with other staff. And, so that would be the duration of the risk. And the nature and the severity of the potential harm would be exposure to COVID and or contracting COVID. And the likelihood that the potential harm will occur increases with the duration, for which that they are interacting with other employees. So CDC basically says that close contact is contact that's within 6 feet for, cumulative of 15 minutes or greater. And if it's greater, over a 24-hour period. So I think that the imminence of the potential harm is going to be fairly high when you think about, depending on what sector you're in and the level, the extent to which the employee is interacting with patients and clients. So again, I think that this is a very fact-intensive inquiry. I don't want you to think that this is a black and white inquiry. And, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out. But again, I think that the belief has to be reasonable, and it must be based on objective evidence. And as I mentioned, it must be a case-by-case assessment. So I think that if you make that determination, it must be documented. And, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out. But I think that as we get more vaccine and, vaccination is available to a greater degree, I think that this assessment is going to change over time. So, for example, the direct threat determination will change as the vaccine becomes more readily available to the general public. So under the EOC guidance, the prevalence in the workplace of employees who already have received a vaccine and the amount of contact with others whose vaccine status could be unknown will impact the undue hardship consideration as well. So keep that in mind. So in other words, the greater the portion of your employees in the population that get the vaccination, the less likely that you're going to be convincing that there is a high threat, right? High risk of threat involved. There are some frequently asked questions that many clients and the public is asking, and I wanted to provide these here because I anticipate that these are going to be asked. So should an employer require vaccinations? I think that you need to consider when you're asking that question, what what are the good employee relations that you can actually engage in. I think that that's really vital because it's one thing to have a policy, it's another thing to have a policy that sits well with your employees. And I think that you you already know, depending on the size of your company, depending on the nature of your business, how your employees may react. And I think that it's very important for you to anticipate, the potential pushback that you'll get depending on the policy that you want to implement. And you want to consider your clients, your customers, your patients, and the public notice. And I think that it's really critical to maintaining focus, productivity, and community relations. Some of my clients are already wondering how much time, energy, and resources it will take for them to have to address concerns if they implement a mandatory policy. And so I think that that is something that you should be considering as well. If you are a larger employer, an employer that involves union organization or unionized employees, that's definitely something to consider as well, union organizing efforts. And I think that you also have to consider whether you will be providing the vaccines on site. Most of my clients who are considering it are going to be sending employees out to, designated sites that they'll tell them about. And again, I think don't underestimate the importance of effective communication with employees and considering employees' needs and beliefs. I think that some of my clients who are making it voluntary, I still recommend as an incentive for you to pay for the vaccine. And I know that I think most of the time they'll get the vaccine for free, but sometimes they won't. And so I think that it is a consideration for you that if it's voluntary, you're technically not required to pay for it. But I think that you still should because I think it'll increase the likelihood that employees will go for it. So another question is, the incentives that you can provide to employees as opposed to mandating it. And as I already mentioned, you can pay for the vaccine. Another one is to provide paid time off, which, employees in California are already allowed to. But for example, if you are using the accrual method for your paid sick leave, they might not have enough days at the beginning of the year to get it, to cash in on their paid sick leave. And so you may, as an incentive, provide that to them. You might even go in the negative with your paid sick leave and allow them, to go in the negative and take their paid sick leave as a, advance of sorts. And there are other options of incentivizing employees to get the vaccine. And, the options range from, giving them wellness benefits to gift cards and, cash incentives. So whatever it takes, whatever you think it will take, that's something that I would consider as an employer. Can an employer request proof of vaccination? Absolutely. The EEOC guidance explains that requesting proof of having received a vaccination is not a disability, and it's not a disability-related inquiry. So as long as the employer doesn't ask why the employee has not received one, I think that you're fine. And when I put together a mandatory vaccination policy and the forms that allow an employee to request accommodation or exemption from the mandatory policy, I make sure to put in there that when you provide the information, that you are not, as an employer, asking them to disclose to you what the disability is, because it's very important. You don't want to ask the information. You simply want to understand that they are asking for it on the basis of a disability or a medical condition. Excuse me. So with that said, any sensitive health information that's acquired by you as a result of these forms, I think that regardless of how the information was obtained, whether it was obtained through a conversation with the HR director or through filling out a form, again, be reminded that you must keep it confidential, even if it's just obtained by voluntary means. The employer just wants to disclose it to you. The next common question is, can you discipline an employee who refuses to get vaccinated? And obviously this would be in contravention of a mandatory vaccination policy. And if you mandate that employees get the vaccine and the employee refuses to provide the proof of vaccination that are and the reasons for the refusal are not related to a disability or religious belief, you may take corrective action against the individual. There is nothing in the law, federal or state law, preventing you from doing so. But, again, I think that it's important to consider public opinion, employee morale, and, recent public opinion polls show that a significant portion of the American population has concerns about the vaccine safety, notwithstanding FDA approval. And I think that, we all know it's kind of the elephant in the room. We all know that the vaccine is still not, 100% safe. At least we don't know whether it is or not. I think that it may be 100% safe. We just don't know it, right? We have absolutely no assurance. And so, given these attitudes that we ourselves have and that, some employees might have, I think that disciplining employees who refuse to get vaccinated could have a detrimental effect on employee morale, not to mention these types of concerns typically lead to employees seeking counsel. So you want to be absolutely sure that you're, treading lightly, that you are consulting someone who can help you navigate this. And again, I want to emphasize that each inquiry is going to be based on the facts involved in the request by each employee. So look, that being said, as an employer, if you've made the determination, if you're in the healthcare industry, that you want to take disciplinary actions against an employee who refuses to get vaccinated for reasons unrelated to disability or religion, then I think that is going to be your choice to do so. And I think it's going to be way less risky. It's never risk-free. However, it's going to be less risky if the employee doesn't give you a reason that's based on disability or religious beliefs. So that's something to, consider. Another question that my clients are asking is, are vaccine-related injuries covered by workers' comp laws? And while clear guidance on the issue remains pending, like everything else, I think that it's reasonable to presume that individuals who suffer, reactions or symptoms after taking the vaccine, especially if the vaccine is mandated based on your policy, that they may be covered under workers' comp laws. But if you really think about it, I think that it's going to be very difficult for the employee to prove that, that the whatever symptoms they're experiencing are related to the vaccine, that they're not just, cold symptoms so I think that it's going to be sort of a, difficult, and it's going to require a lot of investigation and making that determination. So, and at this point, we don't really have any black and white, bright line rules. And so this is all up in the air and is going to be fact-based. So additionally, workers' comp laws aside, employees are able to take paid sick leave, and I expect that they would, right? I don't know why they wouldn't. They would just use their accrued paid sick leave to go ahead and be out for a few days. I know some of my clients already have employees who are seeking, paid sick leave, and that's fine because an employee may be ill and we don't know for sure why they're ill. We may speculate that it's related to the vaccination, but I don't think that it's going to be a clear cut, yes, that's definitely where it's coming from. So also some of my clients have asked whether they can ask employees to sign waivers for, taking the vaccine, waiving liability for any adverse reaction in a situation where you're mandating that they vaccinate. And, at this point, I think that that isn't clear cut whether or not a waiver of that nature would be enforceable. But what I've had employers do, even, back in March and April, is essentially have an agreement or a one page where they basically state, disclose what the risks are. They also disclose what their policies are in, trying to prevent the risks. And I think that that sort of form or disclosure form and acknowledgement of risk is fairly effective. And it also keeps the employee in check that they are obligated to go ahead and abide by your policies and, abide by the, COVID prevention plan that you have in place. And while it may not be 100% something that will allow you to disclaim liability, I think that it will go a long way in showing that you've done your part in making sure that they are informed, and that if they, to some extent, or, decided not to follow the policy, that it's going to be on them, right? So I think, again, a detailed disclosure or notice, it could be a one-pager concerning the risks attendant to remaining unvaccinated, I think is a way to incentivize inoculation. That's all that I have in terms of my presentation of the basics. If there are
Yep.
any questions, I'm happy to take them.
There's some questions in the queue.
Okay.
The first one is, if someone does not want to get vaccinated, is that employee obligated to sign a waiver, which I think you just talked about?
Yeah, I just addressed. The main thing that you need to do is engage in the interactive process to figure out, is the reason based on disability or religiously held belief? And if it's not, as I mentioned, you are free to then go and assess, the extent to which this individual would pose a risk to themselves and to your patients, your clients in an unvaccinated state. And based on the determination that you make, and I encourage that you make the determination and have, documented in writing. And at the end of the day, you basically tell them, look, there's no medical reason, there's no religiously held belief here. And on the other hand, we have patients who are relying on us to, encourage the safe health and safety of the public. And so we are, we really need you to get vaccinated. So that's a conversation that you can have with that individual. But I think the key there is for you to engage in that dialogue to find out what is the reason behind it and to document it.
Okay, so, in the medical field, employees that do not want the regular flu vaccine must sign a waiver. So is this different?
It is different, Nancy. This is really new territory for all of us. It's uncharted in a lot of ways. And like I said, signing a waiver at this point, we don't know what that's going to do, especially when the employer has a mandatory policy. I think that a mandatory policy where an employee signs a waiver isn't going to bode well for someone who claims later on that, look, I had, I told them I have allergic reaction, or I told them that I have a disability, and that waiver isn't going to be worth the paper that it's signed on. So I think the better approach would be what I mentioned, is to have them sign a notice and a disclosure of the risks involved in remaining in the unvaccinated state.
Okay, great. And then we have another question. Can you require a medical provider to support a disability to not get vaccinated?
Wait, I'm sorry.
Can you require a medical provider to support a disability to not get vaccinated? Russell, you want to expand?
Yeah. I understand the question. It's a little, it's phrased in a little differently, but I think what they're asking is, not only can, but the answer is that they should. They should have an exemption request, a request for a medically related exemption. And what I put together is a policy, assuming you want to mandate COVID vaccination. The policy allows you to request an exemption on the basis of a disability or medical condition. What it requires, though, is that a medical provider certify it. So the medical provider will go ahead and provide a written certification on the form. They'll fill out a name without actually disclosing what the disability or the medical condition is, but in essence, putting their name and signature down, certifying that it's real.
Could an employee pursue a reasonable accommodation approach, saying, I don't want the vaccine, the doctor supports that? Or, can I have a non-contact position, for example?
Absolutely. That's definitely one way to go about it, is to provide them with a position that, remote, or that doesn't involve customer service face-to-face, a non-contact position.
And those are the only questions we have in the queue. I don't know if anyone else has any. Oh, here we wait. Is this another one? If we in the medical field were to hire a new employee, can we have a requirement that the candidate be fully vaccinated?
The answer is yes. You can require that the employee is only hired and vaccinated as a condition of employment. And again, you are going to, did you say that they're in the medical field?
Yes.
Okay. So I think that it's going to be a very persuasive case for you to make, that assuming the employee is going to have, interaction with patients and other individuals. And, again, as I mentioned earlier, at this time, because the vaccine isn't available to everyone, I think it's a good time for you to use that argument that you have an obligation, and that employee in an unvaccinated state would pose a high degree of risk to the patients and to other employees and to themselves.